This is Studio 809.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I'm your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media accounts, my other podcast, my photography website, and also you can sign up for my newsletter, and also you can drop me a line if you have a subject or a topic or a guest you'd like to see us discuss on the podcast. You can do that all at hikingbob.com. On the podcast here, I get emails all the time from people wanting me to talk about their product, talk about their books, talk about whatever thing they're doing. Half the time they just want me to promote something so that they can sell more things. And I usually tell them, go away. If they want to promote something, they can buy ad time with me. But every once in a while, a book comes up that I really want to talk about that I find is just really of interest. And today that book is written by a friend who was the first director of the Office of Outdoor Recreation in Colorado, Luis Benitez, and the book is Higher Ground and How Outdoor Recreation Can Save the World, which is a lofty title, and but trust me, he makes the case for it. Luis, thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, Bob, thanks so much for having me. It's good to talk to somebody in the home state of Colorado. It's really good to be here.
And let's just top off. You were the first person to head up that office in Colorado. You left, went back to private industry. Well, you still did a lot of great stuff because you were with VF, and they're the people who own the North Face and a number of other companies. And you still did a lot of work regarding outdoor recreation, and now you are at the Trust for Public Lands. And I probably missed something in between it. You
got it. Yeah, no, that's it. And I think you picked up the through line for all of it, which obviously, you know a lot about from being here in Colorado. It's everything I've done has been associated with the outdoor recreation industry, economy, ecosystem, all the way through my career. And so I think being able to have those three roles that you talked about, I tend to bounce back and forth between public and private sector, as well as the one thing you did miss was a little bit of teaching at CU Boulder in this space as well. So academia also plays a large part, and I think I'm just lucky enough to prove to anybody watching that the outdoor industry and our economy has applicability in all those spaces.
And even before that, I missed you. I believe you were a city council person. Was it in Avon?
Yep.
Yeah,
an Eagle.
An Eagle.
Right up the road, an Eagle. Yeah,
they're right next to each other. So you've had a long history in this. I do know with interest that you do say that public service, being a public employee, should be a temporary thing. You don't, which I spent my whole career doing that, but it's just interesting. You have a different approach.
Well, I think what I was more referencing with respect to a elected office was more of the Jeffersonian model. I think for him, it's not that he served in public office and then just disappeared and went away. You also have to think about the work that he did with the University of Virginia, being a civil servant, a public servant, if you will, but not necessarily being in public office. I don't think that ethos ever goes away. Yeah. But I think the jobs you have, the offices that you hold, even all the way up to the outdoor industry office, for me, it was a generational thing for sure. I wanted to make sure that what came next was well represented. And that's obviously the governor's prerogative as they move along and evolve that office as well.
I think you could also look at the Jimmy Carter model.
100%, even better example, more recent example.
Yeah, I mean, went from military service to government service. Obviously, he's president, and then the stuff he did after he left office, Habitat for Humanity, all those things he did. And there's a common perception that he will probably be regarded as the best ex-president that we've ever had because of all the stuff he did after he left office.
100%. And I don't know if you've seen a lot of him being sort of the unapproved diplomat. He got into a lot of diplomatic spaces after his presidency, talking about not necessarily just opinions of what he thought was important, but really trying to understand how to broker relationships and understanding between desperate voices and disconnected spaces that ordinarily weren't finding a lot of airtime. You know,
Right.
I 100% agree with you that his post presidency has been extraordinary.
Yeah, it has been, and for a guy who's he's been in hospice care for a year, I think kind of defying what hospice care is all about. You know, a year is kind of unheard of with that. So really very different. And I like to think I've kind of followed that model, sort of. Like I say, I spent a career in as a public servant, but I retired 9 years ago, and I'm still doing public stuff with park boards and the Tops Working
Yep.
Committee and friends groups and things like that. So I think once that stuff gets in your blood, it's hard to get it out of your blood, regardless of where you're doing it at.
100%.
So thank you for all your work. And you and I sat in your office one day when you were at the outdoor rec office and had a podcast. We had to leave early because something was on fire in the mountains, and you had to run. And it was an interesting day.
Doesn't that seem like yesterday?
It does, and it hasn't been. It's been a long time. Let's talk about this book you've got. Your argument you're making is that outdoor recreation can save the world. Tell us how that works. How can outdoor recreation save the world?
Yeah, it's big, right? And I think it's one of those claims that people think is just sort of a marketing, a marketing strategy and a little hokey. But I think you better than anybody else really understand when you talk about economic development for the outdoor industry and everything we do being an industry for the United States that's worth 1.1 trillion in consumer spending, responsible for over 5 million American jobs. It's not this small seasonal thing. And then you look through the lens of education and workforce development that feeds into that ecosystem and that environment. And we're talking about rural economic development as much as we are development in urban corridors. Then you look through the lens of conservation and stewardship, how we protect these things, how we view these things not only as nice to have, but need to have. And in that context, how these things get paid for, how they're taken care of. How do we look at nature as infrastructure? I've been a fan of your photography work forever and ever. And so you see these spaces, you understand how these wild spaces aren't just pretty pictures. There's a lot of work to understand how these places are protected, promoted, preserved, and utilized for that matter. And then obviously all that wraps up into public health. I think the pandemic really codified for us, spending time outside is good for you. And when everything else was shutting down all over the country, if not all over the world, the one thing everybody could do was get outside. And it turns out a lot of people did. And it turns out a lot of people recognized that it's good for you, not just anecdotally, but now there is data that proves certain amount of sunshine, certain amount of fresh air every single day really does have health benefits. But now you start to look through the lens of equity and access to some of that stuff. What if your air isn't clean? What if your water isn't clean? What if your natural spaces or trail systems aren't well taken care of? And the stewardship model is missing. So when I talk about saving the world and you look through all of those different lenses, I really do think we're already working and operating towards that goal and in that space. But what I'm trying to do is codify all of that and put the explanation under one roof.
You make the argument. Well, let me go back to the pandemic. Before the pandemic, and I was already involved in some stuff with parks, we were seeing a pretty big uptick in park usage, in trail usage. And at the time I was with El Paso County Parks on their park board, and we were already trying to figure out how to make new parks and how to increase the number of trails. Then the pandemic hits. And my estimation is, and this is just an uneducated, wild guess that I'm just making, but it moved that timeline that we were looking at, probably moved that up a good 10 years. The numbers that we saw during the pandemic, I think, everybody was just guessing. Nobody really knows, but I think we were looking at those numbers being 10 years down the road. So that pushed everything together really almost overnight. We're looking at this great explosion. And I think that also, to your argument about how more people went out there and how healthy it was, A, it was a health thing. B, it was people had to do something. They were told not to go to work. They were told not to go to theaters. They were told not to go shopping. Everything had to be done remotely. The one place they could go was outdoors. And obviously we saw that. We saw the huge numbers. And I think that has, to one of the points you make in your book, that has gotten people to really pay attention to what parks have done and what they mean to a community. And that with right before that, Colorado created an outdoor recreation office, only the second one in the country after Utah. I think people now look at outdoor recreation as not a take it or leave it amenity, but a crucial piece of infrastructure. I know certainly in Colorado Springs, the previous administration and the current one look at at outdoor recreation as definitely being more of a critical piece of infrastructure. Are you seeing that as being a more universal thing, or more and more governments saying parks are just not something we can do without, we really need them to maintain our lifestyles?
100%. And I can make the argument that it's regions and areas aren't just seeing it as a need to have, to your point, not just a nice to have, but they're also doing the math on the economic benefit to a community. They're also seeing that as people move around and migrate and choose where to live and where to invest, the quality of life component, which oftentimes in a lot of places is defined as access to green space, access to the outdoors, that factors in to a huge component. And then you start to layer on, well, what does the canopy look like? The Trust for Public Land, we have a really great set of data at our lab, our Land and People lab, that can really explain how if you have a certain amount of canopy in a certain area at a certain time of the year, you can reduce the temperature gradients significantly. So as heat starts to become more of an issue in the summer, again, getting back to your original point, we're not just talking about, oh, trees are pretty. They decorate the streets, they decorate the parks, provide a little bit of shade. Isn't that nice? We're now looking through it, through the lens of this has serious heat mitigation, pieces to it that can really help.
And one of the things you're also talking about is, the equity of access to public spaces, which, I think every community deals with. In Colorado Springs, we've been dealing with it a little bit, but mostly because of topography. Most of the open spaces that Colorado Springs has are on the west side of town. Well, why is that? Well, because it's up against the mountains. Developers can't build houses there, so we might as well use it for parkland. And it butts up against, the Pike National Forest, which obviously is recreation. We're on the east side of town, nice and flat. It's because, for people not familiar with Colorado Springs, basically the plains run right into a 14,000 foot peak. So the east side of town is where it's flat, so they can develop it and build more and more houses and shopping centers. So building parks there up until very recently has been more difficult, and people on the east side of town may not have the means to go across town to get to that. But now I think we're now making a concerted effort to buy more land. We just bought 1,000 some odd acres of land on the east side of town to expand those opportunities. Are you seeing that when governments are looking at creating new parks, that they're also looking at the economic areas that need them more, or are they still just buying up whatever's available or developing whatever's available as a park?
Yeah, it's funny because you just sort of described, Colorado Springs is a great example of, I think historically, for a lot of places, it's, we access this land as a city or a county as either easements or buffers, or just putting it into the portfolio, right? Having a little bit of land, a little bit of property is just good to have. Cities and counties and towns, if they have the wherewithal and are strategic about it, do it just as a matter of good business. But now, exactly what you're talking about, I think it's a little bit more strategically looked at and how these things stitch together with respect to equitable access. So the best example I could give your listeners would be if you think of a town that has a green belt around it, or a city that crosses multiple municipalities, has to do with a bunch of different landowners, both public and private, how those are stitched together, what kind of trail system goes in. And then the added part to that is, where does that trail system lead? Does it lead to more amenities? Is it a function for commerce moving back and forth for people biking instead of driving their car? Or is it truly a trail to more open space, more green space? So I think as you start to see green belts emerge, as you start to have towns understand the economic development and the economic benefit to actually being strategic with where they acquire these parcels, I think you start to see a little bit more of that investment and involvement with the strategic plan for how a town gets put together.
So you're seeing this as more of a universal thing. I mean, I'm looking through the goggles of where I'm working, here in Colorado, but you're seeing this as more of a universal thing. This is more and more cities across the country, across the world are looking at it more in terms you described.
100%. And a good example I'll give you, and I talk about it in the book, Oklahoma City, which is not a city you would think of as a hotbed for recreation beyond a lot of really good hunting and fishing, put in a whitewater park in their urban corridor and built trail systems that connect the suburban communities to that whitewater park in the center of town. That was a significant investment by the city's leadership to not only put an outdoor recreation amenity in the middle of town, because you would not associate Oklahoma for whitewater, but yet there is a bunch. They just didn't really know how to market it effectively, and they also wanted to understand how to engage the next generation in this and bring a vacation amenity to the heart of the city. And the economic impact results have been astounding over the years since that thing's been open. So long-winded way of saying, yeah, it's impacting in places that you would never think to see this kind of strategy.
So in a place like Oklahoma City, which is, the idea that they had enough foresight to do that, was that a hard sell for the city leadership to sell to their citizens, their constituents, their taxpayers? Was that a hard sell for them, or has this gotten down to where even the common citizen is beginning to recognize that these are things they want to pay for?
Yeah, I think it's really one of those things that it's all timing. And honestly, I think to your point, the outdoor recreation industry offices are new. The ones across the country, of now which there are about 20, have all happened within the last 10 years. I think 10 years ago, this was not a factor. 10 years ago, this was seen as a tourism driver, a recreation thing. It goes on out there somewhere in our state and our town. It's a nice to have, not need to have. And I think there's a bunch of different reasons for that. But obviously, with anything else in at least the private sector, you have to have data. You have to have numbers to make the case. So, for city leaders in a place like Oklahoma to choose to do some of that, and to choose to impact some of that, I think it's one of those things that it had to make sense, and they have to see other impacts happening. Another example I'll give you is West Virginia University has a deep affinity for tourism, understanding how the tourism industry works in their state. But only recently has the outdoor recreation industry and economy. West Virginia University saw everything that was going on in other states and other universities for helping to educate the next generation of leadership for this industry, and ended up receiving a $23 million gift from a private family to just focus on outdoor industry curriculum and for creating the next generation of leadership in this space. That's not something that happened just because that family loves spending time in the outdoors. They saw this as an economic engine for West Virginia that really has tremendous impact. And if you start to ask yourself, well, who's the next generation of leadership? Where will they get educated? That private investment really tried to put a little bit of force behind that for a state that you would not think about with respect to true world-class outdoor recreation or world-class education in that space.
That is true. I mean, to get $23 million is just, well, I mean, the city of Colorado Springs Parks Department budget is just a little bit over that, and that's the entire city.
Yep.
To be able to get a gift that's almost their budget would be tremendous. The federal government has started to, in the last couple of years, track outdoor recreation as a percentage of the GDP, the gross domestic product. With that, states have started doing that because states were looking at that data.
The big thing that started with the Bureau of Economic Analysis looking at our numbers was that Outdoor Industry Association, which is a trade association for the outdoor industry, was sort of doing their own count. But that trade association is only focused on human-powered sports and hard goods, soft goods. And so when you start to think of hunting, fishing, recreational vehicles, OHV, the marine community as well with boating, there's just so many pieces that we're missing if you were looking at the economy in total. And so a significant group from the outdoor recreation industry, from a couple of different trade associations, Outdoor Recreation Roundtable led by Jessica Wall, who's incredible, and in partnership with the Outdoor Industry Association, started approaching the Department of Commerce and basically saying, hey, we don't have an accurate count for this economy. And so to build these value propositions, like what you and I are talking about, to cities to create these things, to towns to invest in these things, if an entrepreneur is considering starting a new brand of outdoor apparel, we just didn't have a good count. And they decided to create the count. And, I was a part of this process, and it's fascinating to hear how they count these different lanes towards the GDP. What is included? What isn't? Is a pickleball court included, but a tennis court not included? And then all the associated gear and all those shops and all those guide services, trainers, teachers. Is Disney something that's included in our count? Theme parks, because it's recreation outside. So being involved in all of those conversations, because that's how the BEA does it, and then coming up with the numbers was a real amazing validator to what we've done and what we continue to do.
Great. I kind of thought that might have been the case. So let's get back to your book. We're talking about your book. One of the things you make an argument about is the difference between outdoor recreation and sports. And when I say sports, I mean hunting, fishing, that kind of thing. And one of the arguments you make is that while hunters and anglers are buying licenses, and OHVs typically need a separate registration, or you buy a boat, you have to register it, and a lot of the times that money goes to Parks and Wildlife. It goes to the Department of Wildlife or State Parks Department or something like that. That the sports industry or the sports users have been kind of funding things that the recreational users like myself, hikers and campers and cyclists and things like that, backpackers, have gotten for free. I think, and while I don't disagree with that concept, and when Colorado, for example, decided that recreational users had to have a hunting and fishing license or a pass to use a state wildlife area that they used to use for free, I was on board with that. I understood that. But can it also be argued that hunting and fishing are more oversight intensive? You have to have game wardens, per se, to go out there and make sure hunters are hunting legally and properly, and anglers are getting their limit and using the right lures. I'm not a fisherman. I don't understand a whole lot of this stuff, but I get how it works. It can also be argued that they have to pay more because there's more oversight required for those activities.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A lot of this legislation's been around since the early 1900s. The Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, I think, was in 1936 or 37. So there's this is nothing that's new. And to your point, in the beginning, yes, it was about regulation. It was about oversight. But then also to your point, as history's evolved and the needs have evolved, we start to see some of these really unique disparities coming up between different segments of the industry. A pretty easy example would be, if I have a $7,000 shotgun and a $7,000 mountain bike, both of which that's a reasonable price for high quality stuff. $7,000 shotgun pays in 18% towards conservation, stewardship. A trail to get you hunting is the same trail you can go mountain biking and probably hiking on. It's just a trail, right? And that 18% of that $7,000 shotgun pays into that. The $8,000 or $7,000 mountain bike doesn't have that set up. What it relies on is an NGO infrastructure, of which there's a kaleidoscope of different organizations, People for Bikes, International Mountain Biking Association, these wonderful organizations that try to deliver on the promise of stewardship and conservation for that segment. So there are, another example, fly rod. You can get an $800 fly rod, an $800 pair of skis. Fly fishing rod pays into that 18%. $800 pair of skis does not. Now, I don't think this is a sense of where the ski industry was trying to duck or dodge that. I think in earlier times, you were selling a whole lot more fly rods than you were skis. Skiing was still very, very niche in the United States back then. But the legislation and the regulation has not kept up as the industry has advanced from the 1930s to now. And so one of the questions I think needs to be asked is, we rely on government aid and support a lot through the form of grants, Land and Water Conservation Fund, a lot of these pieces that are more historical models of funding. And my argument, both in the book and to anybody that'll ask, is if we're truly $1 trillion economy, how hard would it be to take better care of ourselves? So in essence, have our house take care of our own house.
I've often, and I'm not saying that I'm not on board with your argument that recreation should be paying more into it. I mean, right now, like if you buy a hunting and fishing license in Colorado, a tiny percentage of it goes to search and rescue fund, but recreational users are more apt to use search and rescue resources than hunters or anglers. So, but they don't have to pay for it, or you can get a Corsair card and pay for it, which I've done. But they don't have to pay for it. There's these disparities that I've recognized that are not necessarily fair. And I've even argued that what would it hurt if you added $1 to a pair of hiking boots? It's $1. 50 cents even, with the amount of with a tremendous number of pairs of hiking boots, the amount I would contribute to the fund would be outrageous. With how many last week's podcast is about footwear, and we talked a lot about hiking boots and how many boots I go through. How much I would contribute to the economy would be kind of ridiculous. That I've often argued why that's not the case. Why it's not 50 cents on a pair of hiking boots, even if you just did hiking boots, what that would affect the economy and how much that could go towards more staffing and more maintenance and more creation of public spaces for us to use. And the recreational people would be doing more for that. I think also in Colorado, though, with the Keep Colorado Wild Pass now added onto vehicle registration, I think that's helping fund Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and maybe kind of getting that disparity, kind of narrowing that gap, I guess would be the way to put it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned, because I dug into this working for then Governor Hickenlooper. There's a significant percentage of folks that buy fishing licenses in the state that don't fish. They do it for the search and rescue. Exactly. They do it for the search and rescue. I
go to state wildlife areas.
Yep. And like you get the Corsair card, plus the fishing license, and how do you connect some of those pieces? So, keep in mind, we're educated consumers about some of these things. We understand all of that. And, a lot of the arguments for that, to your point, the $1 every boot has been the equity to this equipment. It's already expensive enough as it is. If we pass that expense on to the consumer, there's no way it's going to get, this boot could be $1 more than mine. And so could that determine what the consumer is going to buy? I think all of those things play a part. The bigger question for me is, it's not like that $7,000 shotgun I was talking about earlier is $7,000 and $7,070, right? The manufacturer eats that cost as a reduction to the bottom line because it was mandated by legislation. They did not do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They did this because this was mandated from legislation. I think you see a lot of philanthropic-based work towards asking that question. The outdoor industry has organizations like 1% for the Planet, which I think was the largest scale effort to try to answer some of these questions that I've seen, but it's still not holistic enough, right? And so I think some of those questions, because the lines are blurring, another example I'll give you is dirt bikes, motos, right? So dirt bike, same thing, has to pay a licensure every year, the same way you get a license on a car. And the mountain biking community can make the argument, well, that's motor driven, we're human powered. Those are two different things. Now with the advent of e-bikes, And granted, there are three different classes of e-bikes, and the one with the throttle is completely different than the ones where you have to pedal to make it work. But it is still the introduction of a mechanized device on trail systems that we're saying, no, we're fully non-mechanized. And I think that's a good thing because it pushes the conversation around, should an e-bike, great, same access to the trail, everything else, but because it's a little bit more over there, they should pay in that 18%. That should be a part of the process. And because this conversation is not happening at a federal level all that much, I just don't think the awareness is there to really generate a national dialogue yet.
And I could even argue that there are more pedal mountain bikes on the road out there than there are motorized dirt bikes. I think it's a pretty easy argument to make. So as a percentage of users, the mountain bikers are probably a higher percentage than dirt bikers because of cost and any number of
Absolutely
reasons.
And I think we're going to have to get to a point of the same way the Dingle Johnson and Pittman Robertson, that this legislation sort of mandated, like, here's the impact, here's what's going on. We need more overwatch. I hear it all the time, and I'm sure you do in Colorado Springs as well, at Garden of the Gods and other places. When tourists come in to do these things and there's not enough ranger overwatch, oversight, engagement with the general public. That's how maintenance backlogs went crazy in the past decade, as well. So, the same way that hunting and fishing went through this regulatory question in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, I think we could be there for outdoor recreation writ large, just because of how many people have discovered it, engage in it, want to do it.
The other part of this has been, we talked a little bit about access, is the bane of my existence is timed entry permits and advanced registrations.
Yeah.
And I will say out front, I despise those things. I despise anything that makes me try to schedule my outdoor recreation. On the other hand, I completely see how we got there. Something had to be done to manage crowds and manage traffic. But on the other hand, I hate this. And I worry about we talked a lot about equity, the economic equity of that. I'm a retired person. I can schedule to go pretty much whenever I want to go. It's not hard for me to look down. I mean, it's a little hard, but I can more easily prepare myself for 3 months down the road when I want to go to Rocky Mountain National Park than a young family with kids who has to schedule around school and they might be working more than one job like many people are. It is difficult for them to plan and make a reservation to go to a national park 3 months down the road.
Yeah.
It's hard for them to do it 3 days down the road.
Yeah.
And they may wake up one morning and say, hey, I've got nothing going on. The kids are out of school. It's a beautiful day. Let's go to a park, and find out they can't because all the advanced reservations are full. And yeah, there's some that are held for that day. But obviously, if it's a beautiful day and it's a weekend, those are going to fill up really quickly. And I've often really worried about that. That's not fair. And I'll be honest with you, fixing that is way over my head. I'm not sure how to. I don't have an answer for it, but you can see my concern over that is like, I don't think that it's the fairest way to do it. And I just wish we had a better way to do it. I'm so glad that, like in Colorado Springs, we're mandated the parks have to be for free. Most of the parks were given to the city with the mandate that they remain free forever. Same thing with our county parks. But right now I'm down in Phoenix. I'm vacationing down here. The city parks are free, but you pay to go into county parks on top of the taxes that support them. Same thing with the state.
And a lot of that is
here.
due to the lack of funding, right? That we're talking about getting back to, how do we tax ourselves for some of these things? And I guarantee some of those parks that you're talking about have Friends of Parks groups that try to cover the spread with volunteerism and philanthropy instead of looking through this federal lens of really understanding, how to see nature as infrastructure for some of these pieces. So, one of the things I propose in the book as well is the creation of a federal outdoor recreation industry office that's modeled after the state office, like what we've been talking about in Colorado. And now there are 20 states that have this office. I think it's high time that, when people hear that, one of the questions I get is, well, wait a minute, aren't you talking about bigger government? Isn't that what we want to avoid? You could make that argument, yet my follow-up question is always, tell me of another $1 trillion economy in the United States that doesn't have that kind of support and overwatch. Because the big questions like what you're asking, the mandating of timed entry, the reservation system, there has been, when the feds have gotten involved, some really good stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with recreation.gov, but if you tried to make a campsite reservation, a park entry reservation, obtain a lottery permit, before that website really got up and running in the last little bit, good luck trying to figure that out. So I think if you can navigate the internet, for the first time now, you've got a place where you can actually look, and it doesn't take away the pain of what you're talking about with the timed entry, but it makes it a little bit easier. Now, you look at places like Hanging Lake in Colorado, which it needs a reservation system as well. It comes down to what we're talking about. It comes down to impact. It comes down to the impact about people identifying it on social media, recognizing that they want to go there because it's really super cool and it's amazing. And you got to work to get there, but yet the impact around that area was such that to mitigate that, this was the solution, as opposed to, boy, with a little bit more investment and a little bit more overwatch, we wouldn't need that, because there would be the on the ground overwatch as opposed to trying to control it on the other side. So I think we are going to reach this critical mass where, understanding that we're going to have to find a different federally mandated structure to answer this question. The thing I say all the time, I name a bridge or a highway that you know of that has a friends of this bridge or this highway group. And that's what takes care of the potholes, the infrastructure work, everything that's needed to keep this thoroughfare that drives commerce and industry healthy and good. But yet that's what we're asking for some of these larger, conversations about larger landscapes, is to basically say, well, the NGO infrastructure will take care of it.
So that almost goes back to what you just pointed out, back to my earlier question to you about governments looking at parks and trails as being critical infrastructure. That seems like that is something that mentality hasn't made it down to the grassroots level. So while governments are saying these are critical, you've got to convince the grassroots level that they need to accept, I'm trying to find the right word here, more government intervention, oversight. Overwatch is a word you use, I think, that maybe this is where at the top level they recognize that, but getting the grassroots people to accept that seems to be the next challenge. Like you said, there's not a friends group out there mixing tar and fixing potholes. Nobody, and if you propose that, people would think you were out of your mind. But yet I'm one of those people on a trail doing that kind of work, and so many people are, and we're looking at that and go, but that's perfectly acceptable for a trail. Is there a difference between a highway transporting goods and people than a trail? Yes, but in the grand scheme of things, is infrastructure.
You hit the nail on the head, and I think one of the ways where we are seeing impact is with the state directors. So the job that I had in Colorado that still exists today. Other governors have picked up on this, have created their own offices, and have really started that on the ground impact and influence. One of the things that Trust for Public Lands also does is focus on our schoolyards work. And a lot of that work, while grant driven and a little bit of private philanthropy that we help stitch together, is talking to school districts, schools, communities in different states, and encouraging them to create play structure, outside space that during the school day is an amenity for the children, and after school hours and on weekends is amenity for the community. So again, go back to tree shade, go back to canopy, go back to multi-use, and try to understand, how do you convince municipalities that these things are important? Having worked with TPL for a while now, from a board member all the way up to staff, I can tell you, seeing the impacts here of going from a schoolyard to an integrated trail system to a green space to large landscape public land protection. These are how these communities start the dialogue, especially with respect to the next generation and with kids. To really be able to create that, help folks understand what that means and how that evolves. To your question about how do you get grassroots to pay attention to these things, I think TPL does a superb job of sort of building that life cycle out for a community to help them understand what's possible.
Let's go back to the bigger theme of your book, which is how outdoor recreation can save the world. And we've talked a lot about how we're just saving our own spaces here, land and stuff like that. But in the big picture, saving the world is a pretty big, bold statement for you to make. When you say save the world, we talk about saving the environment, saving the economy, preserving peace. When you say outdoor recreation can save the world, how are you proposing we do? How does outdoor recreation save the entire world?
Oh, that's
I'm putting you on the spot.
That's a great clarifying question. And the good news is we've talked a lot about it today already on the podcast. Imagine if everything we've talked about we get right. Imagine if everything we talk about gets created and we have more funding to understand how to protect and promote these spaces. Even people that aren't outdoorists, I argue all the time, still seek shade under a tree, still understand the value of walking around in a field of grass, still understand the value of the fact that how that impacts things like heat and other pieces of the environment with respect to even clean air. And so I think you don't need to be an outdoors person to understand the value of these things. So my hypothesis is if we get all these things right, absolutely it impacts the environment, which impacts public health, which impacts the economy, which helps us understand how to live, I think, a little bit more balanced life. Now, world peace, that's probably a stretch, but a healthy, engaged community, engaged in that health and in that process, to me, I do think that's how we save that's how we save it. That's how we save the world. You know, there's a reason why when Teddy Roosevelt was talking about places like Yellowstone and the creation of that park, while a bit of it was wildlife conservation and protection, he also wanted that to be built for people coming to see how Americans do things. It was a huge tourism draw. And so when he said back then that the park system was America's best idea, we still, as America and as Americans, I think we have an opportunity to lead the way and to prove that with focus on these things, it can really impact a country's future, which in turn can impact a region's future, and then ultimately impact how the world turns.
I'm glad you, and speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, I'm glad you devoted a pretty good chunk of your book to him because I have long been an admirer of him. Granted, as you point out, some things not so great, but I think if you look at it in the era he was in, he was more progressive than many people in his era. If we look at it through the lens of now, a couple things not so great.
You know, but I think he had a great quote, and I can't remember it right now, but every man or every leader, every person is limited by the knowledge of their time, right? History will look back and definitely say, you got this wrong, you got that wrong, that you were way out of bounds on this and this, but so even I think he understood that history was going to look at some of the things he did and the decisions he made and frown upon them. But I just think as a conservationist, especially sitting in the White House and understanding how all these things stitch together, I mean, all the way down to the Forest Service and what that meant. I've really enjoyed studying the man, studying his history and his politics. And I just think we're missing a little bit of that.
I think, too, that when people are quick to criticize people like in Teddy Roosevelt's era, think for a second how people 70 years from now might look at us and through their lens. And we could sit here saying, we're doing all the right stuff. We're trying to do the right thing. 70 years from now, people might look back at us and go, yeah, you guys kind of missed the boat. Well, in the era we're in the knowledge we have right now, and the same thing with Teddy Roosevelt, he was doing what he could with what he had and what he knew and what prevailing customs, I guess, for lack of a better word, were in place at the time, as we are right now. And you know, even more to the point, you know, I first became a firefighter in 1977. I retired a few years ago, 38 years of doing it. I look back at what I was doing when I started and wondered how I lived through a fire, as opposed to what technology. And 20 years from now, 30 years from now, firefighters then are going to look back at what they're fighting fires with now. We're going to go, how did you guys survive?
Yeah.
Well, we did what we could with what we had. It's the same thing, I think, with that. So I think we have to always keep in mind it doesn't necessarily make things right, but what people were doing at the time wasn't necessarily, they didn't know, I guess, for lack of a better term, is the way to look at it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I went up to Teddy Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota last summer and spent a week there, and it's just that's where where he spent his last days, I guess, for as you point out in the book, and that's where he went and enjoyed time. And the bison up there, the beautiful place, and all these places we wouldn't have if it wasn't for his thinking way outside the box. And he was a recreationist. He was a hunter. He was a fisherman. He was all those things, which gets me to my next question for you. Do you think the conservationists and the recreationists are not on the same page, or are they on the same page? A lot of what we're doing now that we're enjoying as recreation was actually for conservation, and conservation at the time was not preserving trees, but it was preserving hunting and fishing opportunities. Are these things the same, or are they more apart than they were before, or how do we put these things together?
Yeah, I think there were worlds apart historically. I've got a great article from Crested Butte in the 1970s from the Audubon Society that talks about how mountain biking was going to be the downfall of civilization because the mountain bikings were disturbing the bird habitats. Birds couldn't go out. It was going to destroy that segment of the economy, of which was substantial. And and the Audubon Society back then was a political powerhouse. It was a force. And so I think it is reflective of a time and of a generation for how those things got pulled closer together. So I think now what the lens you're looking through is stewardship. I don't think there's a time now where one group can claim dominion over a space or over the right way to recreate and what that means. And so I think the conservation piece is turning much more towards stewardship because, and a actual birder friend explained this to me not too long ago. How do you get a mountain biker, a hiker, somebody that fly fishes to respect what we do as birders all in the same space? So no noise zones, some of these pieces, don't blare music if you're on your mountain bike, because the reality is you can't kick mountain bikers off. They're a part of the ecosystem. So really the conversation around stewardship, I think, has forced the issue in a really great way, because now you have to reach out, you have to engage, you have to find a way to build a bigger table.
I guess looking at, in Colorado here, and I keep coming back, that's where I'm at, the state wildlife areas were designated for wildlife areas. They were designated for hunting and fishing or preservation, but they become recreation destinations. I hike in, the closest one, I shouldn't say the closest one, but the one that I like using is Dome Rock State Wildlife Area, right next to Mueller State Park. Trails connect the two of them. I hike in Dome Rock because it's a beautiful place, but it's actually a wildlife area and it has restrictions to its use, but they become more and more recreation destinations, and these things meld together. I get worried when I see like a national park or national monument getting proposed, and all of a sudden the conservationists are opposing it for some reason or another, when they were the ones who drove this. We're talking about Teddy Roosevelt driving the Antiquities Act and creating the Forest Service and the National Park Service. Sometimes now you see them fighting it because a lot of these things, I think, are being perceived as being created more for recreational use than conservation use. And if you create this place, national monument, hikers are going to come in here and cyclists, and now my hunting is going to get disturbed.
Yep. So and so you're forced to have a conversation in time past. I don't think you needed to. I think you could just sort of stay in your own lane, and if people encroached on your space or what you were doing, there was this capacity to be like, nope, not here, not happening. But now you have to. And I think because of that, slowly but surely, we're starting to see ourselves as one industry. Whereas in, I think, decades past, it was very divisive. It was, if you do this or you don't do that. And in Colorado, I call it the garage principle. You lift up anybody's garage door, any place in the state, chances are you're going to be able to discover multi-modalities of recreation, whether you see the gun safe, the kayak on the roof, the mountain bike in the corner, tennis racket over here, golf bag over there, fly fishing rod on the wall. But the unique cultural thing for our industry is that most people identify through volunteerism and through funding the sport that they gained entry into the industry with. So if I started fly fishing, that's like at my core, and the river that I love is threatened or the river that I grew up fly fishing is threatened, even if I don't fish anymore, I'm more likely to engage in that process politically, socially, and fiscally than I am if mountain biking, which I discovered 5 or 6 years ago, the trail's in a little bit of trouble. Doesn't mean I won't still be concerned about it, but that core thing is what I'm going to engage with. And I think if we give ourselves a little bit more latitude to understand that it's all connected, it doesn't matter how you started or where you are right now, that if we don't focus on it in totality, that's when things start to break.
I'm glad you made that point, because now you're leading me to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. Was we've talked about how outdoor recreation can save the world, and we're talking how governments can work, and we've talked a lot about government intervention and government activity. How does the average user, the hiker like me, the cyclist like many of my friends, the hunters and fishermen, and we talked a little about getting grassroots involvement. How does the grassroots, I just want to go kayaking down the river, I want to go cycling down this mountain, I want to go hunting over there, or fishing, whitewater fishing over there. How does the grassroots user, how do they make recreation save the world?
Yeah, no, I think, it's a great point. And I think that one of the reasons why I start to question sort of the buy-in for all modalities of sport, so you don't have to worry about it, right? I think it's one of those things, to your point. If I'm a casual user, I go to the local shop, in Colorado Springs, obviously, I'm going to Angler's Covey to get my kayaks and, or whatever your local shop is. I think I buy the kayak. I might talk to somebody behind the counter about where to go, what's most important, but I've got it for me and my kids. It seemed like something fun to do. I live close to a river. I've seen other kayakers out there. That's the beginning and end of my advocacy, is purchasing that equipment. And so the argument, again, could be made, if I add on a little bit to that equipment, like it is for hunting and fishing, like it is for boating, like it is for motorized, then that larger conversation can be driven nationally. And where you don't have to be so concerned about it. You can still think about it, but understand that we're taking care of these things for you. Now, I would argue if that same family that bought at a local shop, so helping the local economy, paddles on a local river, falls in love with it, kids get a little bit older, start to see damage to that river corridor, they will go out on their own journey to find an NGO to engage with, to figure out where to maybe donate some volunteerism time or money. And I would argue that the state offices are sort of an extension of that, right? So if you're just wanting to help or understand what's going on, be connected to your state office. That's really a clearinghouse for everything that's going on. Be connected to your region, your town council. Usually, chances are, especially in outdoor communities, have one or two folks that are oriented that way. They can help you understand what's going on. And then if you fall in love with the gear piece of it, the big conversation now with equipment is forever chemicals. And are those forever chemicals that are leaching out of your raincoat or leaching out of the kayak in the river? Like, are you doing more damage through this than good? And, even folks like Yvonne Chenard has said, who started Patagonia, maybe we should stop making stuff like this until science catches up, because these are the materials that we have. This is the science of our time. So to your earlier comment, will people look back on us and say, "Woo, you really got that wrong"? One of the questions I have is, how are we growing some of those things? Now, again, going back to your question and the example of that average consumer wanting to kayak, 90% of those folks won't think about any of this. They just want to go kayaking, have fun, to your point. But much like we ask you to be an educated consumer for everything else that you do, from buying a car to buying a house to for any other big ticket item, this is a lane as a consumer where you have to be educated. I think that's our responsibility, exactly what you're doing with the podcast and your work that you do in helping people understand how to be an engaged and educated consumer that all this stuff plugs into.
So basically what you're saying is, if we do this right, we don't have to, as the grassroots people, be too concerned about this. The grassroots, I'm a more involved person. You're a more involved person. A lot of people who listen to this podcast are more involved, I think, than the average, like you said, the person who goes, "Hey, kayaking looks like fun. I'm going to go buy a kayak." And they, not for any bad reason, they're just not thinking about the big picture, because A, they may not want to, or B, they just don't know to. But it sounds like you're just saying, if we do this right, we don't have to burden everybody with how to think about this in the big picture.
And when I say burden, maybe that's, too
And I
strong.
use that word, but
You know what I mean? I think for me, the sense of stewardship and responsibility, you said it about hiking boots. Like, not only if you just give $1 and that's built into the cost, but you understand where that dollar is going. You can buy those boots, I don't know about guilt-free, but understanding that you're buying into a system that should have direct local impact to what's going on and what you're doing. There's so many people that have fought for so many dollars, like getting the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanently funded. I mean, I'm sure you do too. I know people that work their entire careers on that process. And when that was done, they're like, I'm retired. This is good. Like, it's permanently funded. I helped get it across the finish line and I'm done. The reality is, oil and gas revenue goes down, LWCF funding goes down.
Right.
I think it's cyclical like anything else. And if we think that there's always going to be this government subsidy to take care of it, we've already proven that usually that falls short.
Well, Luis, we've been talking for almost an hour. This has been a great conversation. I want to tell people that we have touched on a tiny part of what's in this book. There's some great stories about how many trips did you make? You climbed Mount Everest 6 times?
Yep.
6 times on Mount Everest, trips to Antarctica. There are great stories in this book. I really encourage everybody to pick up the book. It's called Higher Ground and How Outdoor Recreation Can Save the World. Pick up a copy of this book, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes where people can find it. Luis, it's been great talking to you again. We could probably sit here and talk all afternoon, but I know you've got stuff you need to do, and I've kept you here a long time. But any last things you want to say to everybody, something I forgot to ask you about or something we didn't talk about that you want to give everybody before we go?
No, Bob, thanks for having me. And I just hope everybody that's listening takes this unique opportunity this summer to get outside, spend some time outside.
Yeah, get outside, folks. It's going to be I'm hoping for a wonderful summer. I'm having a great spring, and I'm hoping it just continues for the rest of the year. Again, Luis Benitez, Higher Ground, How Outdoor Recreation Can Save the World. Get a copy of it. It is really a fun book to read, and it's going to make you think a little bit, too, and hopefully this podcast did, too. And with that, I'll say, Luis, thank you again, and everyone, thank you for listening to the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast. We'll talk to you next time.